let's insert a sleeve into an armhole. By now, you should have already created your sleeve. And now the only thing left to do is to put on these sleeves. Okay, so we're gonna start by turning the dress inside out. And then I'm gonna grab one of my sleeves, and then I'm gonna try to figure out which armhole this sleeve goes in. With the sleeve turned right side out, I'm actually gonna turn it around this way, and I'm gonna tuck it inside the armhole so that the whole of the sleeve is matching the armhole on the dress. And then I'm gonna look for my little notches. We have a double set of notches on the sleeve, and then we have a corresponding set of double notches on the back bodice. I'm actually holding this. So this is the back of the dress, this is the front of the dress, and so the back of the dress has the double notches. And you can see here that the double notches in the bodice and the double notches on my sleeve are actually matching up. So this is good. This is the correct sleeve for this hole. So I'm just gonna proceed to pinning. If these notches weren't matched up at this point, I would have had to take the sleeve and put it on the other armhole. The first thing we're gonna pin is the large dot at the top of the sleeve cap to the shoulder seam on the dress. So I'm going to align the sleeve to the dress shoulder seam, right sides together, and then from the top, so from the dress, I'm gonna go ahead and pop my pin right through the shoulder seam, right through the middle of that shoulder seam. And then I'm gonna bring my pin back up through the large purple dot. And actually it's a little off, so I'm gonna shift it over a little bit. I want that purple dot to be right at the shoulder seam. So again, I'm gonna put the pin through the shoulder seam, and then I'm gonna find my dot. Let's see. Okay, that looks pretty good. So it's going through the purple dot on the bottom on the sleeve, and then when I look back on top, my pin came back up right by that shoulder seam. Now we can keep going. So the next pin we're gonna do is we're gonna match the underarm seams. So I'm gonna match the little tiny underarm seam from the sleeve to the side seam from the dress. And so again, just lining those up perfectly. And I can feel with my fingers when they're matched up. And then I'm gonna go ahead and pop the pin in, again from the dress side. So make sure you're pressing your pin down on the dress side. And then back in, and then the pin is going right through the seam on both layers. And then the head of the pin is pointing towards the circle that we're gonna be stitching around. Okay, where are we gonna put our next pin? We're gonna pin the double notches. So let's do that. That one's easy. Now, if all went well, oops, crooked pins, I hate crooked pins. If all went well, between this underarm seam and the notch, there should be no wrinkling. So this should lay smoothly. This little distance should match up perfectly. So now I'm gonna turn my project around, and the next thing I'm gonna pin is, you guessed it, I'm gonna match up the single notches at which the single notch would be at the front of the dress and then at the front of the sleeve. And once again, I can't overemphasize that really when you look at what's going on here, I am pinning these two elements right sides together. So the right sides of the fabric should be touching, the sleeve and the dress. And that's why we turned the dress inside out, but we left the sleeve right side out, so that when we put the sleeve inside the dress, everything magically matches up, right sides together. So just putting the puzzle together. It's a good enough match. And then I'm just gonna pin the rest of that distance between the underarm seam and the single notch. Okay, let's go on to the next section. So the next thing I'm gonna pin is the little purple dots. So on our sleeve we have a purple dot, and on the dress we have a purple dot. Align those, and I'm actually gonna start pinning this time. I'm gonna put my pin through both circles. And so I'm gonna put it through the top one on the dress, and then I'm gonna look underneath, and okay, the pin is not coming out through my dot on my sleeve, so I'm just gonna take the pin out just from the sleeve, and then I'm gonna reinsert the pin so that now it's coming out of the dot in the sleeve, and then I'm just gonna go ahead and flip the head of that pin back in. And so the head of the pin is not poking out quite as far as my other ones, but it's still poking out towards the armhole. So now the rest is pretty easy. Now, if you find yourself, if you find that the sleeve is a little too much fabric at this point to match this, what you can do is you can go under your sleeve and take your threads from the wrong side of the sleeve, and you can pull them a little bit. And just make sure that you're not pulling the threads on the right side of the sleeve, of course, as always. And I just want to point out that this is why I had suggested that when you create your gathering stitches, that you sew from the top of the sleeve and that you pull the strings from the bottom, so that now when we're at a point where we might need to pull the threads a little bit more, those threads are accessible to us. If we had pulled the threads on this side of the sleeve, we would have to be digging in here to try to pull those threads out right now, and that wouldn't be as easy. So that's why strategically earlier on we made sure that we were pulling the threads from under the sleeve. See how that works? Very cool. Took me a long time to figure that out when I was a beginner, because I was having to figure this stuff out on my own. But hopefully that helps to make the process easier for you from the very start. So, okay, so now the rest here is pretty easy. So I'm just gonna go ahead and pin these little stretches and just smoothing it a little bit so that it's, I can feel in the inside row of gathering stitches that it feels pretty smooth. So it gets pretty bumpy towards the edge, that's okay. But at the line where that inner row of gathering stitches is, it's actually pretty smooth. And I'm just gonna go ahead and pop some more pins in now to fill in this little curve, and then come back down here and fill in the area between the single notch and the purple dot. Okay, so a lot to think about here, especially the first time doing this, and that's why I just wanted to make sure that my explanation was very detailed. And then as you get practice, this is going to become very second nature, especially if you learn to do it right from the very start. Okay, now we're back to the other side, and so what are we going to do next? You guessed it, we're going to go ahead and match up the little purple dots from the other side. So once again, I'm just gonna drop my pin down through both layers, and I'm gonna look under, and yep, so there's a little bit of a mismatch, so I'm gonna pull my pin out just from the sleeve, and then I'm gonna reinsert it right through the center of the purple dot, and then I'm gonna flip it back over to the dress side and pop my pin in. And almost there. we go. Sleeve is all pinned and ready to be stitched to the dress. And so I just want you to peek at this. If we were to flip the dress inside out at this point, that's actually already looking like a sleeve pinned to the dress. See how that works? So, but what we're gonna do now is we're gonna take this to the sewing machine inside out, just as we had it. And we're gonna stitch right around this circle to secure that sleeve to the dress. Now that we've got this sleeve pinned into our armhole, now we're gonna go ahead and secure these elements together. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove this part so that we can slip our sleeve right around the middle part here. And I'm gonna start stitching right at the underarm seam. So we're gonna start and end at the underarm seam and just go around in a big old circle. So pull your threads back. And then I'm stitching with a 2 length with a straight stitch, and everything else is normal. 0 width, needle position, center, tension 4. Okay, so I'm gonna stitch with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and it's just exactly the same as other stitching that we do. The only difference is that we're gonna have some very sharp curves to get around here and a lot of pins. I'm putting my needle down right in the middle of the underarm seam, and I'm gonna start stitching. And for this, it helps to just kind of tug behind a little bit to get it started. And then I'm just gonna get it started, and then I'm just gonna pull out my first pin right there at the underarm seam. And then I'm just gonna start sewing, and I'm just gonna pivot. Again, this is kind of like when we did our neckline. There's a lot of pivoting that's going on here. And so just take it slow and pivot as much as you need to. So I'm going around here, and again, pulling a little bit with my right hand. That's okay, using my left hand to keep it steady, and should be pulling my pins out as I go. There's a lot of pins, so sometimes it's hard to remember to pull all of them out, but do your best. And now you take it slow. So it's helpful to just kind of see how I'm putting my hand underneath here, just to help keep the layers flat underneath. It's very, very easy if you're not careful for the sleeve to want to pucker upwards, and then you're going to end up stitching, you know, multiple layers of your sleeve, and then you have to undo that, and that is not fun. So just try to slip your hand underneath to try to keep the layers smooth as they're coming up in front of you. So that's my best suggestion. If you don't do it perfect the first time, you know, that's understandable, but that's what you're trying for. Okay, and now I'm going along. So after you get past the first notch there, it tends to get a little easier for a little bit until you get closer to the shoulder seam. So just keep going on, trying to keep my layers lined up as much as possible. And see, since we're stitching from the smooth side of the fabric, that makes stitching a little easier than if we were trying to stitch from underneath with all this bumpiness going on. So this works out much better to stitch from the top, from the dress side. So that's why we pinned from the dress side. Just take your time. Just a little bit at a time. You may have to readjust after every pin just to make sure that your layers are smooth underneath against your needle plate. So here we are, we're getting to the shoulder, and it gets a little tricky sometimes in this area, but again, just take it slow. The sleeve wants to double up on me underneath as I'm going over this shoulder seam. That's okay, I'm just gonna keep it under control. I'm gonna keep going. And, oh, so sometimes the pins wanna pop out on you. So if that happens, just pop them back in, just like I did here. So that wasn't too bad, but I did have a couple pins that wanted to come out on me. And I put another one in there to try to keep that secure. Okay, so on to the second half. So again, feeling underneath to make sure that that's still flat and laying together, and it is. Okay. So the spinal stretch tends to be the hardest, I'll warn you. And I don't know why that is. It's as you get towards the bottom again, there's this curve that's gonna wanna come this way. And so you have to start adjusting to try to make sure that your curve is not going in the other direction. So just watch out for that and, you know, be patient. To the end. So it's feeling pretty good. Almost there. So my layers were wanting to get away from my 5/8 inch seam guide for a second there, but I got it back on track. And just a couple more pins out, final stretch. So I'm just readjusting at the back here to get it curving in the right direction. As you're sewing over your seam allowances at your underarm seam, I guess one thing to watch out for is just to make sure that your seam allowances aren't flipping the wrong direction like this. So make sure you keep that nice and flat so that when it's all stitched up, the seam allowance is still stitched flat. Oops, okay. All right. And all right, so we are back to where we started. I'm just gonna overlap the stitches a little bit, and I'm gonna back stitch just to reinforce the stitching at the underarm seam. And I'm just gonna pull my threads out, and I'm just gonna cut just these threads. I still have my long threads from my gathering stitches, just in case I still need those, so I haven't cut those yet. And meanwhile, I'm just leaving those out of the way as much as possible. And so now let's see what we have. So that looks pretty good. And at this point, I just want you to look all around your seam, make sure that there's no weird folds or puckers or anything like that. And because if you have very bad folds or puckers or places where you've sewn over your sleeve in multiple layers, at that point, this is when you would need to grab your seam ripper and try again. But I have done well and everything looks good, so I am ready to go to the next step. Okay, so at this point we've stitched our sleeve onto our dress and we've checked around and we like how it's looking. So I just wanted to show you the next step. So now that we know that our sleeve is there for good, so now it's time to pull out these temporary basting stitches. And at this point you could just kind of cut the long strings, the long threads if you wanted, and just call it a day and then flip the dress back over. And then look for any of those basting stitches around the perimeter of the seam where your dress and your sleeve are attached. So you can see there's a few like little long stitches here that I could take my seam ripper and pull out. But to make it a little easier, I'm gonna first, before I go for my seam ripper, I am going to try to pull out the threads from underneath. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab one of my threads, and then I'm gonna grab the other one, and I'm gonna pull them together, and I'm gonna see if those are slipping through pretty easily. And they are. So as you can see there, they are pulling out very, very nicely. And I'm just gonna pull them all the way out. So, well, and then they broke, that's okay. Just keep pulling. And then I'm gonna pull from the other side. Now, very important, obviously, at this point you are pulling only your basting stitches, not your permanent stitches. And I'm gonna find them on the other side and pull that out. And pull that out, and voila, the basting stitches are completely gone. Well, and then if you flip it to the other side, and then I have one here that I can still pull out there, but now it's nice and loose because the one underneath was removed. And there we go. So see, that was really, really easy compared to taking your seam ripper and trying to pull those long stitches out all the way around. So there's a little trick for you. Okay, so before we go any further, now would be a good time to look back at our instructions, because different sewing patterns, they have subtle differences at this stage about how we want to finish the sleeve inside. So we went ahead and stitched our sleeve on, and then the designer here is asking us to stitch again 1/4 inch away in the seam allowances. And then they want us to trim close to second stitching. Okay, so let's stop there. So what that's asking us to do is to take this back to the sewing machine and then stitch in the seam allowance just 1/4 inch away from our original row of stitches. So nice and easy all the way around, just stitching the seam allowances together all the way around. And now the second row of stitches is in all the way around. And so now we go back to our instructions, and it tells us to trim close to second stitching. So what that means is I'm gonna take my scissors and I'm just gonna trim all the way around. I'm just gonna pick a starting point. Create a nice little narrow seam allowance all the way around my armhole. And what's nice about this method is that it's creating this beautiful smooth edge inside your dress around your armhole. So you want to get close to the second row of stitches, but ideally you don't want to cut through your second row of stitching. Trimmed all the way around. I'm just going to throw this away, and I'm going to check around for any long threads that remain. Some final detail work here, and look how beautiful that looks now. That is just gorgeous. Oh, here's a long thread that remains. Let's get that thread. Okay. All right, so now let's look back at our instructions, and it tells us that they want us to press the seam allowances flat. Okay, so let's go to the iron and do that. All right, and so it's time to get our ironing on. And to assist in this process, we have, you guessed it, our old friend, the tailor's hammer. So the first thing they want us to do is press seam allowances flat. So I'm gonna put my armhole seam allowances right over my tailor's ham. And then I'm just gonna take my iron and press just right around the edge. So I'm pressing those 1/4 inch remaining seam allowances flat. What that's doing is that's smoothing out all of the remaining wrinkling from when we gathered our sleeve cap with our gathering stitches. still see where the original dot was on the dress. Of course, that'll wash out with water. You can either take it to the sink to wash that out just under the faucet, maybe with a little soap if you need, and then it comes right out, or you can put it in the washing machine. And back to where we started. And okay, so that's smooth. And then one final step, turn seam allowances towards sleeve. So what does that mean? So now we have these little seam allowances. When we lay it like this, here's the sleeve, here's the dress. We have two choices in what direction we could flip the seam allowance. We could either flip it towards the sleeve or we could flip it towards the dress. And it's telling us to turn seam allowances towards the sleeves. So they want us to flip it this way so that that little fold is resting on the inside of the dress along the sleeve. And we can help that process along with our iron and our tailor's ham. So once again, I'm putting my tailor's ham inside my sleeve, and you can see how nice that is because the tailor's ham here almost looks like a shoulder. And so I'm using that tailor's ham almost like a little shoulder. And I'm just gonna grab my iron and iron those seam allowances flat against the sleeve. I think that's done. Let's turn it right side out and see what we have. I'm so excited. Okay. Ah, that looks great. So it's nice and smooth all the way around the sleeve. And just for a finishing touch, it's a good idea to now iron on the outside. Looking pretty good. And there is the final product. I'm really liking this dress. I know it's simple, but it's great.